Good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. I hope everybody had a fantastic weekend, and hopefully you had some time to get outside a bit. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Toledo weekly Zoom meeting featuring guest speakers Sylvia Whitlock and Francine Kiefer. Now, I'd like to pass it to Mike George for the meeting reflection, and then to Rotarian Heather Carnes to lead us as we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let us pray. Dear God, as Rotarians, we are called to be inclusive. As leaders, we champion inclusivity, sometimes quietly, sometimes with righteous indignation, and sometimes ahead of the needs of ourselves. To do great things is difficult, but to lead others to greatness is more difficult, yet in the end, more rewarding. Please guide our Rotarians here today to forge new paths, to create new opportunities, and to humbly ask for your guidance. Let us all remember that we never stand taller than when we kneel to help another along the journey of life. Amen.
Amen.
Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Heather. As we begin our meeting, I'd like to thank and acknowledge our August weekly meeting sponsor, Toledo Federation of Teachers. Thank you, Rotarian Kevin Dalton. Just a couple of quick updates today. Perhaps you've noticed that Kathy, our executive director, is not on our meeting today. Well, it's because she's at the Park Inn with the movers as they pack up the Rotary office and move to the Toledo Club, which will happen within the next day or two. We won't be up and running, as she says, until early October. You've also probably noticed in our weekly spoke, all service committees are now meeting and in the process of vetting 15 grant applications recently received for a total grant request of $134,000 from our foundation. And one more point that I wanted to touch on, as a vibrant club and as committed Rotarians, our service committee serves as a cornerstone of our club, connecting you, our foundation, and your donations directly to the community. To help bridge your connection, we will take a weekly tour of all service committees each Monday, as we mentioned in the spoke on Thursday. Our first tour of a service committee is with Community Services, now reviewing 8 different grant applications. Here to let you know what's happening with our Community Services is Kelly Train, chair of the committee, to begin our inaugural tour. Kelly?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for this time. I'm excited to share with you more about the Community Services Committee. This is one of the principal committees for our Toledo Rotary Club. There are 7 altogether, and the role of our committees are two things. One, to vet the grant applications that come before our committee, and we conduct site visits, we review the site visits, we decide which grants are going to be able to move on to the next level, the Foundation Advisory Committee, and then eventually be approved by our Foundation Board of Trustees to be able to help serve the communities that we live in. The other part of what we do is we help also by giving our time, and we give our time through different community service projects. We've worked with other committees on food packs. We've been talking about other projects that we can do in the community related to perhaps recycling or census counting. Lots of things are happening in community service, and I invite you to come anytime and join our committee. Our next meeting will be on August, our next meeting will be coming up here very soon. I don't have the exact date right in front of me. I apologize. but you're going to really enjoy being on this committee. And if you don't like this committee, you can always join some other committees as well, like I have. I've joined the Peace Committee and the Vocational Services Committee as well to help expand my Rotary horizon. And you may ask, why are you getting involved? Why are you doing all this? And I feel like it's part of my job as a Rotarian to become more familiar with the club, what we're doing as a club, and how can I work to be bigger than myself to help make meaningful change happen in our community. And being involved in Rotary and being involved in these service committees is really what makes it happen for me. So I hope you reach out, come and join one of our service committees, especially community service. And I look forward to talking to you later. Thank you, President Alex.
Kelly, thank you for your leadership on the Community Services Committee, as well as in our Downtown Toledo Rotary Group. Now for a new member introduction is past President Hunt Sears. Hunt?
It's my pleasure to introduce Jim Benor to Toledo Rotary. Jim was born and raised in Toledo and attended St. Francis de Sales High School, where he was active with athletics. He attended Xavier University, where he graduated with a bachelor degree in liberal arts and was part of the baseball program. He spent most of his working life in Toledo, except for a short span living and working in Los Angeles. He currently works with Croak Asset Management as a financial advisor. Croak's an independent fiduciary firm that recently relocated to downtown Toledo from Perrysburg. Prior to that, Jim was with Mass Mutual. He's been married for 17 years to his wife, Erin. They have 3 children, including a sophomore at Notre Dame Academy and a 6th grader at St. Pius. Erin is a teacher at St. Francis de Sales. When they're not chasing kids around, they spend their summers in Marblehead enjoying boating in the islands. Jim's an active member of the Toledo Club, where he plays squash, and he serves on the Avenues for Autism board. Jim's pet peeve is plumbing repair projects. Please join me in a warm Rotary welcome for Jim Benor.
Welcome, Jim. Congratulations. You have just joined an organization with over 1.2 million members worldwide, and you are their newest member. We look forward to your leadership. And now I would like to invite a superstar, Leslie Vassar, to present a check to our foundation from the Jim Vassar Memorial Golf Tournament. Leslie?
I want to thank you for having me on. Our next event is actually coming up. So I'd like to bring that to your attention, as well as let you know about our donation for this year. So last year's event, we raised a total of $18,300 that we are dividing between our 3 charities that we support, including Downtown Toledo Rotary, the American Brain Tumor Association, and ProMedica Total Rehab Education Fund. So we are presenting Rotary with a check for $6,100. And this is our 7th time we've been able to do that. So we're super pleased to be able to do that. This year's event happens on Saturday, September 12th. Registration starts at noon, and we'll have a shotgun start at 2 o'clock. This is the 8th annual event. As many of you who knew Jim, he passed away from a brain tumor 7 years ago in June. So he was a very committed member of Rotary, was very involved, and so we're very pleased to be able to continue to give and support the vision that he would have still been doing had he been here. So I hope to see some of you out at our event. If you haven't registered yet, you can go to vastmangolf.com, or it's my understanding that the brochure will be available out on your website. We have room for teams, individuals, whole sponsorships, or if you even have donations that you want to make for our raffle, that would be great. Oh, there's our website. So thank you so much to all of you for what you continue to do. And thank you to my committee, including Gary Murphy, who is a valuable part of our committee. So thank you so much for your support of this event, and we hope to see you in just a couple weeks.
Thank you, Leslie, for your generous contribution. I actually had the opportunity to play in this event last year, and man, it was a blast. And I certainly hope that I have the opportunity to play this year. So if you're not registered yet, please check out the website and come join us. Now, I'd like to have past president and former district governor Chuck Stocking introduce our program speakers. Chuck?
Thank you, Alex, and welcome to Sylvia and Francine. About 50 days ago, I became aware that the Pulitzer Prize-winning Christian Science Monitor had plans to dedicate one of its August issues to a focus on the women's suffrage movement and its success via the 19th Amendment 100 years ago this month to secure the right to vote for women. I had some discussions with the editor of the Monitor about the possibility of putting together a special program for our club featuring Rotary pioneers in this space alongside one of its Monitor journalists to give some perspective on this aspect of social justice. There's no question that women are playing a major role in the development of Rotary around the world today, as well as in our club. But it hasn't always been that way, and it hasn't been easy. The program committee gave the green light to the idea, and Jennifer Jones, a past Rotary International director, also endorsed the concept of a panel discussion involving her and our guest speaker, Sylvia Whitlock, the first women in Rotary to share their story and Rotary's evolution on this issue. Sylvia graciously agreed to tell her amazing story, and the Monitor selected its West Coast Bureau Chief, Francine Kiefer, to share the Monitor's comprehensive coverage of the suffrage issue as well as her own experience. Hopefully from these pioneers in social justice, we can all gain some insight on the path forward in other areas where reform is needed. One often asks the question, what's the why for a program like this? And I think there's three reasons. One is, first, we have the anniversary of the suffrage amendment, and it's that occurred in a very, very difficult time in our country and lots of emotion around the issue. Secondly, it seemed like a very good way to recognize and express appreciation for the vital role that women are playing in the world of Rotary. And third, logically, this program also provides a moment to reflect on the learnings of the past as we strive to resolve social justice issues of today, some that seem very, very difficult. So many thanks to Sylvia. Let me introduce her now. What a wonderful example of a life very well and very selflessly led. You can read a good deal about her background in the spoke, but here are a couple of interesting points that tell you a lot about this Rotary pioneer in social justice and economic development. Number one, her love of learning and serving is evident in her academic pedigree and her role as a principal of an elementary school in Duarte, California, where she became one of the first women to join a Rotary club in violation of Rotary International's restriction based on gender. She became the club president in 1987, the very year the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Rotary restriction. A difficult role to take. Two, she has served in almost every capacity possible in Rotary, at the club level, the district level, and even serving Rotary International as a district governor. I hope that she will share her many breakthrough adventures as she has lived a life that really exemplifies service above self and the four-way test. Thanks, Sylvia. We look forward to hearing your comments.
It's really My pleasure to be here talking with you about some of my memories in Rotary, sharing my thoughts about diversity. But when diversity was proposed to me, I couldn't separate it from equality and inclusion. And though I'm not going to give you my whole speech on those, I will stop at the beginning of the equality and inclusion section. So I'm going to talk to you about my memories, my thoughts about Rotary membership, how embracing one helps the other in terms of diversity. And if there was ever a time when we should think about embracing diversity, this is it. It's well known that when new Rotarians are asked why they didn't join Rotary before, the most common response is, no one asked me to. Well, we'll have a look at some of the reasons why that happens. I'm an educator and a psychotherapist by profession, and I think I should know how to measure up people, especially when I'm looking for prospective Rotary members. Well, I will share with you some of the experiences significant to our Rotary journeys and some of the life lessons I have learned. Remember President Gary Huang? He said, light up Rotary. All the presidents have had a theme. Billboard said, lead the way. President Mavinjan said, be a gift to Rotary. And behind me, I have a banner from Sakuji Tanaka who said, peace through service. Well, let me tell you a little bit how Rotary changed my life in the process of service above self, the learning and the opportunities for growth, the arena in which I could get a glimpse of some of the concerns that we as Rotarians try to address. I will talk about women first, since that was the situation near and dear to me. The story was how I came into Rotary. It's still relevant because in the Rotary world, only 18% of the members are women. In the United States, it's probably a little bit over 30%. Now there's an opportunity to increase membership and promote diversity. I've had a number of years, over 40 years, to learn about this institution called Rotary International, to feel myself a functional part of this great humanitarian organization, probably the greatest, certainly the largest of the humanitarian organizations that we know. But there were many organizations, but I had the good fortune to be invited by a far-seeing Rotarian, and I always like people to note that the compliments go to Richard Key, who was superintendent of schools in Duarte, because he was the far-seeing Rotarian who invited women to join the all-male Rotary Club of Duarte. He took a chance to invite women because he was invested in the possibilities that could come with a larger club. When I was invited to join the Rotary Club of Duarte at the time, engaged in a court struggle over the admission of women, I learned about the place to which many women were relegated in the minds of men and women. There were many women here and overseas who opposed the admission of women. And believe it or not, I met some of them in India some years ago. Really stalwart group of Rotarians who didn't want to give up their identity as the women who supported the men in Rotary. A club had invited them to join, but they were somewhat reluctant. The cultural divide was a concern. I had a short talk with 3 of them the night I was there in India and shared my experiences in Rotary. They joined that night. I think they were just waiting to be persuaded and are now an active part of the Rotary Club of Calcutta Metropolitan. But back to Duarte. As we made our 11-year journey, count it, 11 years it took us to get through this. As we made our 11-year journey through California courts, we received a few gender-based, unpleasant telephone calls, and I found myself wondering about the deep-seated beliefs that were leading many to reject the idea that women could be capable Rotarians as volunteers serving from their heart. Service above self. Is it the self that says there should be no women? Are you interested in the service the women could provide? Had we looked around, we would have seen, as past President RI President Mateo described it, women working alongside men in almost every area of employment. As physicians, as professors, as engineers, as construction workers, as business executives. When the first Rotary bylaws were written, they specified that Rotarians should be persons of integrity. Somehow, at a time when there were more men than women in the management positions of the workaday world, that morphed into men of integrity. It wasn't tested until the women were invited to join Rotary, and then the uproar resulted in the recall of the charter of the Duarte Club. Rotary International removed the charter of the club because there were women who were invited to be members. What then was the genesis of that belief, outside of the bylaws, that women were not worthy of or capable of being Rotarians and working to provide the same humanitarian assistance that men were doing? Well, it may not even have been a relegation of women to a place of lesser importance and value, but may have been a belief that women couldn't shoulder the outside the home work that needed to be done. Or I would like to believe that some men were so invested in the valor of their commitment to Rotary that they didn't want to share it with women. Either way, the result is that a part of our society excluded, without good reason, another part deemed incapable of sharing their exploits. We have learned from the presence of women in Rotary that they are capable of much more than behind-the-scenes meal preparation, as one caller suggested. Interestingly enough, most of the great chefs are male. Is it as Claire Booth Luce said, because I'm a woman, I must make unusual efforts to succeed? If I fail, no one will say she doesn't have what it takes. They will say women don't have what it takes. Well, there are still clubs today, notably one in New Jersey, that say they cannot find Rotary caliber women. Well, a few years ago in Victoria, British Columbia, a past president told me that 14 male members resigned when he invited women to join his club. He says they were replaced and their duties assumed by 4 women. Do you see? They do. They can and do work alongside men, bringing their mystique to the board tables, the work trenches, the financial negotiations, and all of the parts that men and women have been so successful in doing for the past 25, 30, 40 years. Yes, there is a gender perspective, but it is not a conflict-producing perspective. Susan B. Anthony said, "The day will come when man will recognize woman as his peer, not only at the fireside, but in the councils of the nations." We're doing that. Then, and not until then, will there be the perfect comradeship, the ideal union between the sexes that shall result in the highest development of the race. One of the responses we had to women in Rotary was a question about whether we would open it up to other races. I assured the caller who asked me that question that we had with my induction. So what of the other situations that tend to limit our access to capable Rotarians, as it once limited our access to capable women? My grandmother used to say, "Never judge someone by the way he looks, or a book by the way it's covered, for inside the tattered pages, there's a lot to be discovered." She taught me, never judge a book by its cover. But I only really understood that phrase when I had a significant thought-altering experience some years ago. I was raised in a third world culture in Jamaica, where class distinctions were the rule of the day and the main earmarks of prejudice. Because I was a light-skinned Black person, I thought myself immune to the pronunciations of worthlessness heaped on darker-skinned persons. As a younger person, unschooled in the etymology of the Black race, my response to differences were largely only skin deep. And one of the insidious consequences of prejudice is that you can be taught to undervalue and fear, even disdain, those of whom you are really a part. As a musical commentary on life in the 40s, Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote South Pacific. Here a part of Charles Wagner's rendition of You've Got to Be Careful at Heart. Kevin set this up for me. And if you know the story, it's the scene in which the young Lieutenant Cable is being courted by Bloody Mary as a husband for her Polynesian daughter. He is told by a colleague that his reluctance comes from something with which he was born. He disagrees, in the words of the following song. Kevin?
You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are roughly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
Okay, and here I am, a Black woman, no doubt carefully taught, maybe not by words, but certainly by examples, attitudes, innuendos, and dark humor. But my soul-searching moment, and we all need to have those, came when I ran out of gasoline on a busy New York City expressway, and my car sputtered to a halt in the fast lane where there was no shoulder. I walked ahead to the highway patrol phone to report my problem, and I was told by the person on the other end of the line, "If you're still there in an hour, call us back." So as I stood there befuddled and probably looking very pathetic, a car going in the other direction on the other side of the freeway pulled up, and the driver, a Black man with his head tied by a ragged handkerchief, called out, "What's the matter, baby?" I can't adequately describe for you my problem, because the hesitation with which I explained my problem, because I was looking right at the cover of this man, and it was everything I had been taught to avoid. He said, "I'll get you some gas, baby." And in the 10 minutes or so before he returned, a million unpleasant scenarios played in my head. He returned, poured gasoline from a can into the gas tank, poured some on the carburetor, and started my car. I offered to give him the $3 I had with me, but he refused it, saying it only cost 29 cents. This was back when you could do that. I went on my way. I was only about 10 minutes from home. Went inside and took a deep breath to reconstruct what had just happened. What had just happened was that I had found, inside some tattered pages, a gem. I replayed the potentially dangerous situation, stranded on the freeway, and realized that it was that concern for my safety that led me to trust in a seemingly undesirable quantity. I dug deeply to find the genesis of my beliefs, which had excluded this man from my circle of acceptables. Recently, a friend of mine driving at night on a Connecticut freeway stopped when she noticed a stalled car on the side of the road. She pulled up in front and walked back to the car where a Black man was in the driver's seat. He chided her for stopping and putting herself in what may have been a dangerous situation. I don't think I have to explain that. It's a journey we should all take, hopefully without the push of a precarious situation. Today, I look back at the naivety of my thinking then. Should I have been concerned about the appearance of the man who stopped to help me? His color, over which he had no control, or his behavior, over which he has the ultimate control? Could he have made a good Rotarian had our meeting circumstances been different? Our perceptions, if we're not sensitive to the fact that they are not reality, can lead us to undervalue some people. I'm going to end with this quote from Martin Luther King, but I'll come back and give you the rest of this talk if you're interested in hearing it. Martin Luther King said, "Men often hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they cannot communicate. They cannot communicate because they are separated by the very real racial divide." Thank you for listening.
Sylvia, awesome. And I know there'll be a bunch of questions because your Rotary journey, no doubt, included enormous contributions and achievements. And so I look forward to, at the discussion period, maybe you can share a little bit more about that. So thank you very much. Now let me introduce to everyone Francine Kiefer, West Coast Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor. In addition to the information contained in the spoke, you should know that, one, with over 40 years in journalism, she knows a thing or two about the difference between accurate, non-biased journalism and opinion writing and coverage. Two, she has witnessed dramatic change in the makeup of the press corps and in opportunities for women as journalists and as public servants. And three, she has been a firsthand witness to one of the most famous denials of social and political justice while serving as the Monitor's correspondent in Germany in 1989. Please recall the Berlin Wall sealed off all the population of Berlin and East and West Germany. That was the year that the injustice represented by the Berlin Wall finally imploded. Please welcome Francine Kiefer.
Thank you, Chuck, for having me. And Sylvia, I loved your talk. It was so meaningful and deep and beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with all of us. It's a real honor to take part in this webinar. My best friend in high school was a Rotarian, and he came from a whole family of members. So I'm well acquainted with Rotarian values. Today, I'm going to talk about the characteristics that brought about the precious right to vote for women. And I think you'll recognize them in the values that Rotarians also express. So Kevin, if you could put up the first slide, suffrage cover. At the Monitor, we thought the right to vote for women was so important that we devoted an entire issue to the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States. The question is, what can we glean from that today? I'd like to quote from the main article written by Elaine Weiss, who also wrote a book on the subject. Here's the quote. "We tend to envision the American woman suffrage movement as a triumphant newsreel of women in white dresses and fabulous hats marching to victory, as enlightened men suddenly and nobly hand the ballot to female citizens, all female citizens. That newsreel is romantic fiction," she says. "The truth is grittier," she goes on, "and more important. It required 3 generations of fearless activists over a span of more than 7 decades, working in more than 900 state, local, and national campaigns to finally win the vote for American women," she writes. So if you examine that paragraph, you'll see qualities and characteristics such as perseverance, grassroots activism, leadership, and having a plan. In this presentation, I will look at how those ingredients for social change played out in the suffrage fight and in my own experience as a female journalist covering politics and foreign affairs. Then I'll offer a few thoughts on today's racial justice movement. So let's have the second slide. the 6-week brawl. By August 1920, 35 states had ratified the 19th Amendment establishing a woman's right to vote. They just needed one more state to get the three-quarters required to change the Constitution. It all came down to Tennessee. But the decision there did not happen in a vacuum. It was preceded by decades of grassroots activism. More than 70 years before, American women gathered in their first convention to demand women's rights. They spent 40 years trying to push their constitutional amendment through Congress. It failed 28 times before it passed in 1919. Over the decades, these activists were ridiculed, attacked, jailed, and even force-fed when they were on hunger strikes. When the Tennessee legislature convened in Nashville in August 1920, it was a fraught time with parallels to today. It was a presidential election year. The Spanish flu was waning. 600,000 Americans had died from the Spanish flu. A shaky economy was heading toward the Great Depression. There was labor and racial unrest. 6 weeks of fierce campaigning descended on this southern state. The suffragists, who, by the way, were divided in their methods and means about how to approach this whole issue. The antis, who were fiercely opposed to the suffragist movement, and intense lobbying from outside interests. The railroads, for instance, feared women voting would disturb their cozy relationship of bribes with legislators. The textile industry feared the end of cheap child labor and cheap female labor. And churches saw the women's vote as unchristian and not according to the women's role depicted in the Bible. Let's have the third slide, Harry T. Byrne. So it all culminated in a defining event on August 18. The legislature was tied. Harry Byrne, a 24-year-old freshman, favored women's voting rights, but had sided with the antis and his constituents who opposed voting rights for women. But on the morning of the final vote, he got a nudge from his mother. She sent him a letter and finished it with this line: "Now be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt." She was referring to Carrie Chapman Catt, who was at the forefront of the suffrage movement. So Mr. Burns switches his vote and changes history. You see these characteristics in what I was just talking about: perseverance over decades, grassroots organizing, courageous leadership among activists and lawmakers, and a plan. Let's have the fourth slide of Karen Bass. The point I want to make here is that you can make tremendous progress in social justice, but you have to keep working at it. The fight for the women's vote didn't end in 1920. Although Black women helped organize for the vote, they were sidelined by Jim Crow laws that did things like apply literacy tests to keep African Americans from voting. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that Blacks could exercise rights they already had. I interviewed Congresswoman Karen Bass, who's a Democrat from Los Angeles, to ask about this. She is the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. After World War II, her dad was part of the Great Migration West and became a mail carrier in Los Angeles. He was too traumatized by Jim Crow in Texas to ever talk about it with his family, she said. But he made voting a ritual in their house, preparing his ballot and laying it out for the family to study. She calls the vote of women a historic achievement, but she also says that women in politics, which is where she is, still have a long way to go. Despite a wave election of women to Congress in 2018, for instance, women still are only 25% of Congress. Nearly 40% of them are women of color. Still, she's encouraged because so many programs are now helping women learn how to run for office. This time, a record 6 women ran for president. More Black women are running for office than ever this year. And vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris is the first woman of color on a major presidential ticket. Let's have the 5th slide, the Monitor's founder, Mary Baker Eddy. Now I'd like to comment specifically on leadership. Mary Baker Eddy holds a special place as a religious leader and publisher in American history. Think of it, before women even had the right to vote, she founded a church and a worldwide newspaper. Since its founding in 1908, the Monitor has won 7 Pulitzer Prizes. If it were not for Eddy, I would not have had a chance to work at a news organization that is unique in journalism. How many other media do you know with the motto, "To injure no man, but to bless all mankind"? I strive to put that into practice with stories that are balanced, insightful, and offer hope. I also owe much of my career to another woman leader, Catherine Fanning. In 1983, she became the first woman editor of the Monitor since its founding. She worked hard to diversify our newsroom and promote women. She promoted me and several of my female colleagues, and I am a direct beneficiary of her leadership. Let's have the 6th slide, women reporters. If you want to see how far women have come in media, look at this picture. I am in the green jacket interviewing Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the basement of the Capitol in what we call a walk and talk interview. If you count the people in the photograph, you will see there are at least 4 women reporters. I'm not sure about the woman on the far right. She may be an aide, but the others I recognize as reporters. There are only 2 male reporters. The man on the left is an aide. Although I don't have data, by the time I left the Hill last year to move to the West Coast, I would say women reporters easily outnumbered men. Let's have the 7th slide, the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of communism in Europe meant freedom for millions of people. I was fortunate enough to report on it as the Monitor's correspondent in Germany. As I think back on that time, I can't help but notice similarities with the fight for women's suffrage. First, it took persistence over decades. Uprisings in Hungary and Prague that were brutally put down. The 1975 Helsinki Accords between East and West that established agreed on human rights that then became foundational to future dissident movements. Strong military spending by the West forced Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to loosen the economic and political reins. When the wall fell on November 9th, 1989, it was because of courageous East German protesters facing off against police and a promised Tiananmen Square solution by East Germany's leaders. And when it came to reunification, you can thank the leadership of West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and American President George H.W. Bush. Both France and Britain wanted to put it off for 10 years. The United States insisted the post-war powers live up to their obligations, and allow the Germanys to unite. But like the suffrage movement, there has been backsliding in Europe since the fall of communism. Countries like Hungary and Poland are showing disturbing autocratic tendencies. I am reminded of Ben Franklin's comment that here's a republic if you can keep it. Keeping these kinds of gains takes work. Let's have the 8th and final slide, activist women of color. Let's look at these qualities in the context of today's racial justice movement since George Floyd's death. Certainly, the protesters have persisted in their fight for racial equality, a struggle that goes back to the first slave ships. Interestingly, these protests have included a lot of white people who also want to do something about police brutality and institutional racism. So you've got your grassroots activism. What about leadership? The Black Lives Matter movement is spawning a new generation of leaders and was itself founded by 3 Black women. The story on your screen talks about this rising generation of leaders. But the leadership at the grassroots level is also pretty diffuse. Do they have a plan? That's hard to say. Democrats this summer passed a police reform bill in the House, but only 3 Republicans voted for it, and the GOP Senate is not taking it up. Meanwhile, the demand from activists to defund the police has many definitions. Joe Biden says he is against it. At the same time, what started as a promising movement has become mired in violence and politicization, which makes it hard to know what is going to happen with this movement. What we do know is that major social change is not easy. It takes persistence from the grassroots and leadership from the top. We also know from many other examples that it is possible.
Francine and Sylvia, thank you so much. Chuck, we'll go back to you if you've got something to add.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask Sylvia, during her time very active in Rotary, what are the 2 or 3 things that she looks at as major contributions in the world of Rotary that she particularly embraces?
Oh, I think, how could I get past this without mentioning Polio Plus? The year that I came into Rotary as a woman, as the president, was the beginning of Polio Plus. And looking at pictures of the world as it was then and the world as it is today, especially with the recent dropping off from endemic countries of Africa. And someone questioned about that because there's still polio in Africa, but the wild polio virus is not present in Africa, and officially it is not endemic. The polio and the eradication of polio as only the 2nd eradication in the world, since smallpox. That is a big thing for me. I've been to NIDS and I have walked the streets with women who were giving inoculations against polio. So that's a big thing. But the other thing for me is what we've done for education in Rotary. And I refer probably specifically to the education for girls that I see in India, because as a district governor, I work pretty closely with the school in India. And India in Piali, someplace maybe about 30 miles away from Kolkata, where girls had no education. And now there's a wonderful school that educates 200 students. They've recently come through a cyclone, a cyclone that wasn't called coronavirus. So in addition to the cyclone, they also had coronavirus. So they're going through a lot of things to take care of that situation there and to get the girls back in school. Just the same way the girls are being taught distance learning, the same way we're teaching our children here distance learning. It's more of a challenge there because we're talking about a poor community where the girls don't all have the equipment that they need to work at home. However, those, both of those two, and then I watch what Rotary is really getting on the map in terms of its response to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They have a committee that was just established to work with that. They have made a big move in getting Jennifer Jones to be the 2022 president of RI. So they are trying, and I see them making moves, not just sitting still and listening. The incidents getting women in Rotary was a huge thing, and I think that they probably look back at that now with some regret, because there is not a good way for me to understand how for 11 years there could be a group of people who are interested in serving mankind who are excluding women from that. So, there are those things, and I stay involved in Rotary because it allows me to contribute what I can to making this a better place.
All right, so we're open up to the club. If you've got questions, you can raise your hand, and we're going to go to Maria White for our first question. Maria, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Kevin. First of all, I just want to thank both of you for an amazing presentation today. It was inspiring, it was educational, and I'm thrilled that I was able to listen to it. I lead a small inclusion and diversity company, and I've been doing racial justice work for 33 years. And so I know I'm asking you a big question, but if you could give advice to those of us that are in the fight, what do you believe needs to happen? What do we need to do in order to achieve racial justice in this country?
First thing we need to do is look inside ourselves. Kendi has this wonderful book out, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Because you say, I'm not a biased person and I'm not a racist person, doesn't mean anything is happening. If you don't do something about it, if you don't be an anti-racist, then the situation just remains the way it is. If you look at those people and you say, God, what are they doing? I think that's terrible. I wouldn't do that. Okay, but what would you do?
Yes.
That's what we need to focus on, is what we would do to change the situation. Not just sit back and say, I don't do that. What do I do?
It's interesting that you asked this question, because at the Monitor, we've been pushed by the younger generation of journalists to re-examine ourselves, to re-examine our staffing, our culture, our newsroom atmosphere. And this is happening in newsrooms all across the country. So there's actually a tremendous amount going on, I think, but organizations need to be willing to look at how they've done things for decades. And, they may not have had malevolent intentions, but, and I certainly wouldn't say that Monitor has ever had malevolent intentions along those ways, but there are definitely things that need to be corrected. And that's this whole idea of institutional racism. So I'm really grateful to the younger staff at the Monitor who has raised some issues, and we've got some good things going on there now that I think are good, to help address this issue.
Thank you.
Excellent. Again, if you've got a question in the participant tab, you can select raise hand. I can't promise that if you physically raise your hand, I'm going to see it on the little thumbnails throughout this call, but I will ask if you've got a question. You can either type it into the chat or you can put it in there. And I guess while we're waiting for a question to come in, I will kind of toss to both Francine and Sylvia. How do you in your head kind of wrestle? And I know you've talked about this throughout your presentation, but specifically, how do you wrestle how far we've come with how far we still have to go?
I want to tell you a little story. My daughter who's since passed away, when she was growing up, we were always in a family, a group of friends who were mixed colors. Everything was here. And Meredith didn't identify herself as being a Black person. Okay, she was just a person. We had a group of teachers from school looking through our house and looking at pictures of her in our ballet classes. There are probably about 5 or 6 years of ballet classes. And in each one, she's the only Black child in it. And she would say, "Can you find me?" And it never occurred, everybody would laugh, but it never occurred to her that that was funny, because her identification of herself by color was not there. And I used to say, we raised Meredith to be colorblind. And her brother, who was only maybe 2 years younger than her, read that paper I wrote, and he said, "Mom, you're not colorblind. You are aware of the color. In your heart, you have a different response to it." And that's what we need to go with. And young people today do make the difference. There's just for them common humanity.
That is a great question, Kevin. It really is. I was thinking it through as Sylvia was talking there, what I would say to this. And let me just pause it, because I've just come off 20 years of being a political reporter in Washington. So that is where my mind is a lot. And I would say we've made such incredible strides in terms of gender diversity and racial diversity. But I have watched in horror as bipartisanship on Capitol Hill and in Washington has just gone on a steep downhill. And it just isn't possible in our system to have my way or the highway. It just is not possible. So I feel that the next frontier has to be not just gender and race, but it has to be a thought change. It has to be willingness to listen to each other. Willingness, when you see the yelling going on, to not do it yourself. More self-control of our behavior. And, I wish we had more of it from our political leaders on both sides. But when you don't have that, you have to engage in it yourself. Whether it's how you behave on social media, how you talk with your friends on the other side, if you even have friends on the other side anymore. So this to me is the great challenge. It's really a character, behavioral, heart kind of challenge. And, yes, I do care deeply about gender and racial diversity, but I think we need a whole new uplifting of character, of thought in this country.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to squeeze in one last question, and I can see President Alex already getting antsy with the clock. So bear with me. We're going to go to Kelly Train, who's with the Girl Scouts, and I'm excited about her questions. So Kelly, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sylvia and Francine. Your comments have been wonderful. And what I'm wondering about is, how do we encourage and foster that conversation with our girls and with other people in our community to keep that conversation going, and how to manage when you feel that people are attacking you for your thoughts?
All of us are born with bias. If you're not normal, and we talk about that with our kids. I talk about that with my son. I talk about that with my grandchildren. When they choose the toys with which they play, they choose those toys that kind of look like them. If my granddaughter is choosing a doll, her father would kind of steer her towards the doll that looks like her, but she wants the blonde doll with the long braid, and that's okay too. You need to learn to love all of them. You need to talk to your kids about what it means. When we think about racism and what we have against different races, I got almost sick the other night because I was thinking about Jewish jokes that we used to tell. Like, how do you get, 5 Jews in a Volkswagen? And I wouldn't tell it anymore. I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot rod. For some reason, it didn't get to the heart of me when I was doing that. And I think those are the things that we need to look at and talk about. When you look at children's cartoons on television today, they have all the colors of the spectrum on them. So that kids are being raised with different appearances, different visions than we were raised with. And that's what you need to encourage and look at. My kids speak fluent German, Spanish, and my 3 grandchildren speak fluent German, Spanish, and English. And they watch the cartoons in all those languages on TV. Their dad was a law student in Germany, and he became fluent in German. And so he was determined that his kids were going to grow up speaking another language from the day they were born. And so that's what he did. But it's good for them. So when they hear other languages in other places, they don't think there's something really different. We are all common humanity.
I don't have much else to add to what Sylvia said, because basically it comes down to the golden rule, right? If we don't practice the golden rule, we'll become like, you know, the Balkans, or we'll become Lebanon, or we'll become the Middle East, where you're just going to have revenge going against revenge. So, you know, when we get insulted or bullied about what, you know, for our gender or the way we look or whatever, you know, we can defend that in terms of the beauty of our own essence, but we can meet that insult with kindness, because honestly, if you just meet it with more bullying, it just is a downward spiral. So I totally endorse what Sylvia had to say there, because essentially it's life by the golden rule.
You know, Francine, I want to, you know, when I did my my doctoral studies at Claremont, I did my dissertation on a law we had in California that we loosely call 3.3. Anybody remember that? 3.3 said that all teachers in schools with more than 25% minority had to be schooled in multicultural education, so that we could use the things that we learned there as we taught in schools. Well, I wrote my dissertation on it because it wasn't happening, because nothing was going on with it. And if you look at the schools today, you'll find that still there's not a lot going on. Just look at the camp just had a program yesterday. Just look at the statistics, the data, and see what's going on in the schools, and become an anti-racist. Be active in changing those things for your kids in school.
Sylvia and Francine, thank you so much. Chuck, thank you for bringing this program to us. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to President Alex.
Thank you, Sylvia and Francine, for an inspirational, informative, and thought-provoking presentation. In appreciation for joining us today, we'll be sending you a well-known book of Toledo, Historical Tales of Toledo, authored by past President Clint Mock. We will also make a donation to the Polio Plus Fund in your name. And again, thank you for joining us today. Next week, Monday, September 7th, there is no meeting in celebration of Labor Day. And today we have 3 committee meetings following this Zoom meeting: the membership development via Zoom with Board Liaison Bob DiNardo, the Peace Committee via Zoom with Board Liaison Kevin Mullen, and International Services with Board Liaison Patrick Sheehan. Please stay on the Zoom link, and Abby will put you in the appropriate breakout rooms for your meetings. And now to send us laughing. I know we're running a little bit over, but we just can't go without Chuck's chuckles another week.
I'll be as brief as I can. Final resting place. 99% of people relate the solemnity and gravitas connected with final resting place to the philosophical thoughts. They wax poetically, and they create a memorial for the decedent. I'd like to show you a few examples of people that thought outside the box. She always said her feet were killing her, but no one believed it. And the Markle family, who are always thinking of sales. So 38 years for Bill and Chris. Ralph is under the ground. Come visit us in our new location. Damn, it's dark down here. Joan Hackett, a comedian from the 60s, 50s and 60s. Go away, I'm asleep. Merv Griffin, I will not be back right after this message. Mel Blanc, the finest voice actor that there ever was, man of 1,000 voices. His final words, that's all, folks. Here lies John Yeast. Pardon me for not rising. Here lies an atheist, all dressed up and no place to go. This gentleman had high expectations of his memorial, but I was hoping for a pyramid. I told you I was sick. Rodney Dangerfield still gets no respect. There goes the neighborhood. Billy Wilder, a director, author, created a movie in 1959 called Some Like It Hot. He directed, produced, and wrote the screenplay. And the final line on his tombstone are the final 2 words in that movie. If you've seen the movie, you'll understand. If you haven't, it's a very, very good movie. Joel Cheskin, at last, a hole in one. And finally, George Jr., who said, I knew this would happen. President Alex.
Thank you, Chuck. You certainly have made us laugh for the day and maybe even the week.
Okay.
Again, thanks to all Rotarians and guests for joining us today. We are adjourned.